And so our event that we have today is being given by Cecilia Tomasati and Lars Nauborn. So I'm going to read their bios just so you have a little bit of information about who they are. So Lars is a graduate student in English linguistics. He was born in the Netherlands and was raised bicultural and bilingual in the Netherlands and the United States. He did his undergraduate studies at Grinnell College in Iowa, and his research interests are dialectology, language contact, and ethnolinguistics. And Cecilia is also a second-year MA student in English linguistics. She's from Northern Italy, and she's here as a Fulbright Fellow. Her research interests include language contact, identity construction in immigrant communities, and ESL. Hi. Yeah, it is. Yes, ma'am. And we have snacks in the corner if you'd like some. So previously she studied translation and interpreting, and she's always eager to learn about different cultures, languages, and food recipes. So you can feel free to share those with her, but I'm going to hand it over to them. Yeah.
All right, so we'll start with a couple icebreaker questions. Just like raise your hand if one of these applies to you. How many of you, show of hands, have taken a foreign language class before? How many have studied abroad or lived in another country? How many people have had someone comment on your accent, either in English or a language that you learned before? How many of you have commented on someone else's accent before? It's pretty much everybody from us. Right?
Yes, yes. So just give you a quick example of what usually happens to me. When I get on an Uber, the first couple of questions are always the same. How are you doing today? The weather is so nice, blah, blah, blah. And no later than 5 minutes, I always receive the same question. Where are you from? And that can be different. So it could be, oh, you have a lovely accent. Where are you from? So that can be nice. It can show the curiosity of people because they hear that I have a different accent. So they really want to know where I'm from. And then the conversation that will follow is always nice because they will say, oh my God, Italy is so beautiful. I really want to go there. But other times I wonder if, why did they ask me where I'm from? Is my accent that foreign? Why is that so? Why would people ask? And why would they point out that I'm not a native speaker? So this is what this talk is about. So we'll try to go step by step through all the myths and give you the facts about what is happening in this context.
Right. So one thing we have to get out of the way so we're all on the same page is that everyone has an accent. Some accents are considered marked or stigmatized, so that's when people will say like, oh, this person has an accent, this person has a strong this accent or this accent. But really, everyone has an accent. It's just that some accents are considered the standard or unmarked, so people won't remark on them. So if some of you might have been told you don't have an accent, that's not really true. You just have an accent that is not considered marked or unusual in any way in the place where you live. And this is due to historical power relations between groups that have each accent. So whatever the group in power speaks tends to be considered correct or the standard. But there's nothing inherently better about it from a linguistic perspective. Like, we spend a lot of time studying this kind of like scientifically. At some point you just get to the level where we're just literally looking at the differences in sound waves between two different vowels, and then you can just see that there's like nothing inherently better. Your tongue is in a slightly different place when you say a certain thing. You say some consonants one way, some consonants another way, some vowels one way, some vowels another way. There's nothing inherently better at it. It's just that people assign values to accents based on their attitudes towards the people that have them. And it's also worth noting that there are currently more non-native than native speakers of English in the world, so having a foreign accent is relative because most people who speak English have an accent.
So now let's try to understand better what a native and a non-native speaker are, if there's such a thing as a native and a non-native speaker. So we're going to use this very effective metaphor, the sound house, developed by E.P. Green. So let's imagine that a kid starts acquiring a language, and we're going to use the metaphor of this phase of his life as building a sound house. So he would go to this warehouse where all the building materials are available. And by that, I mean all the possible vowel sounds or consonant sounds of any language. And he would pick the building materials that he sees in his parents' sound houses, let's say. So he sees that his parents' houses are made of stone. So he would choose exactly those stones. And he or she would build a sound house. When this person grows older, he or she might see that there are other people in the world having different sound houses that are made with different materials. So this person might say, well, let me go back to the warehouse. I really want to add to my house, my original house, another addition that could be this other language. But once he goes back to the warehouse, he no longer can get in. He's too old, he's too big to get into the entrance. So this person can no longer get the same material. Let's say that a Spanish sound house is made of bricks, but he can no longer get those bricks. So what can he do? Well, he can say, let me start and make those bricks from scratch. Take some mud, cook them, and no matter how much effort this person can put into building exactly the same bricks, anyone will always see that those bricks are not the same as those of native speakers with a Spanish sound house. So this is basically, in a nutshell, the difference and why we say that there are native speakers and non-native speakers. Non-native speakers would always have an original, let's say, stone house with a brick house attached to it. But native speakers will always recognize what is the original part and what is the addition to it.
Right, so this is a pretty important concept. Like, once you pass a certain age, they're not exactly sure when it is or why this is. You can't really acquire all the sounds of a new language fully. That's the system. You can't really enter into that new system. You just kind of stuck with what you learned when you were a kid. It's also it's possible for people to have more than one sound house. I would say that I have more than one sound house because I was raised bilingual. So when I was really little, my mom spoke English to me, my dad spoke Dutch to me. So I have more sounds than other native English speakers would. But at the same time, when I try to learn a language that has a sound that doesn't exist in either of those sound houses, I still hit a point where I can't really make a sound, or I can get close, but it doesn't really sound as natural as it would from a native speaker. And then a big part of that is just because someone hasn't mastered every sound of the language doesn't mean they're not competent at speaking it. So Arnold Schwarzenegger and Henry Kissinger are both examples of people who have noticeable non-native accents in English, even though they've lived in the United States for a long time. Arnold Schwarzenegger, obviously a movie actor, former governor of California, recently got involved with this movement and gerrymandering. He's clearly very competent in English, able to talk about complicated social issues and things like that, but he still has a noticeable accent. You guys probably know what he sounds like, so I don't think I'm going to play that clip, but I do want to play a clip of Henry Kissinger for a second. He was Secretary of State under Richard Nixon, and I just want you to see that he's lived in the United States for about 60 years or so, right? So most of his life, he's lived in the United States. I want you to see that he still has his old sound house.
An occasion for pessimism. On the other hand, simply is looking at somebody as a student of the future. I find it sort of interesting that there is now going on there conversations inside Iraq between the various parties, not going very far yet. Secondly, that there is a meeting of ambassadors which will graduate to foreign ministers of all surrounding countries, plus Egypt, plus the members of the Security Council. And that people are talking of broadening yet a third level.
Right, so Henry Kissinger, clearly very competent in English. He won a Nobel Peace Prize for his diplomatic work conducted in English. He held a very high public office in English in the United States, not his native language. He's written books in English, not his native language, but he still doesn't pronounce all the sounds exactly in the same way that a native speaker would. In this video, you can hear him saying third instead of third, for example. dropping some of his R's, pronouncing some of his W's like V's. There's just a point where you can't ever fully like latch onto a new system. If you learn the language as an adult, even after 60 years, his accent hasn't really changed very much. So basically, it just because you have an accent doesn't really imply anything about your overall competence, and also not necessarily about your competence in English.
What was his first language?
German. Sorry, I should have mentioned that. Yeah, they're both native German speakers. My dad is a native Dutch speaker, and his English is good enough for him. He wrote his dissertation in English, but he also has like certain words that he just like pronounces slightly differently because if he really concentrates, he can maybe get there. But it's like in casual speech, he'll still have a noticeable accent.
Arnold Schwarzenegger is a German Austrian, so it's not quite German. There's a big difference.
Well, he's a native German speaker, but he's from Austria, so his accent will be a little bit different. But it's not a native English accent.
So let's try to understand what happens when we associate some meanings to specific languages or language varieties. And that's what we call in linguistics either language ideologies or language aptitudes. So by language ideologies, we mean all those beliefs by which people represent, explain, and justify their own linguistic behavior and interpret and assess that of others. So usually, let's say that we have a language. Every time we hear someone speaking that language, we link that to broader social, cultural structures that are already there in place. So it's very difficult to consider a language and then leave out all the rest, because it's all one thing together. And also we have language aptitudes, which is your personal subjective evaluations about a value of a specific language and also of their speakers. And that a very easy example is, let's say, the attitudes that we have toward dialect speakers versus the standard speakers, if we can consider them as such. So it's always based on personal views, beliefs, and experience, and never on truth linguistic criteria. So we have to bear this in mind before we move forward. And that's why let's go back to my example when I said, how should I react to the where are you from question? And a professor here in the English department looks specifically at this question when it's prompted by foreign accents. So it's not just about two native speakers talking to each other when they ask, oh, where are you from? And the other one would say where they're from. It's when a native speaker understands that he or she is talking to a foreign one, and this person would ask, where are you from? So that is problematic because it could be reinforcing the difference in status between the native speaker and a non-native speaker, saying, me as a native speaker, I am more powerful and more entitled to ask you this question versus the non-native speaker who is other, meaning that the power relation is not equal, but it's unbalanced toward the native speaker. And also, imagine an immigrant being in the US for a very long time, decades. And these people would still get this question, and then they would say, well, I am part of this country the same way other people are part of this country. So it's also a matter of how to feel part of a group, how we belong to a specific society or a specific language. And that's the difference between in-group versus out-group. And it would also tell us a lot about how people perceive themselves. Because me, like, as an immigrant, I can tell that I can be Italian American, but if someone would ask me, where are you from, they may be questioning my identity as an Italian American, and they might be saying, oh no, you're just Italian, you're just a foreigner in this country.
Yeah, and again, like at a linguistic level, if you study this scientifically, the where are you from question shouldn't, like, shouldn't really be a thing, because like to linguists, everyone's speech is interesting. Everybody's from a place, everybody has an accent, everybody's speech has different kinds of features that you could look at. Whereas in this case, it's only being asked because someone wants to know what this foreigner is doing in their country. That's the, like the underlying ideology. Like that question basically comes from like a purely ideological place and isn't very like scientifically based. Foreign accents are often portrayed in the media, especially in cartoons and comedies. A lot of movies and TV shows deliberately use accents to tell us something about a character. Cartoons and children's media are especially known for heavy use of commonly occurring stock characters, like the mean boss, the dumb blonde, etc. In a movie or TV show, you want to introduce a character and explain a whole lot about that person. You don't necessarily have a lot of time to do it. How they speak is one way of telling you a lot about that person. Stock characters are popular because they're easy to write, and because the audience will instantly recognize them and know roughly how to feel about them, because they tie a movie or TV show to other movies, TV shows, and books. So if you see a mean boss in one movie, you'll be like, you can say, okay, it's like the mean boss in Office Space, or like the mean boss in this book, or something like that. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Like if they're recognizable characters, it saves time and like allows you to know things about the character without like spending forever telling you their entire backstory. But some of these really like end up becoming stereotypes, which could be kind of harmful because they cause people to make assumptions about people who actually have those accents. So as we're going to go through some examples of characters with foreign accents, and try to think about like what characters with the same accent tend to have in common with each other. So for like people with Spanish accents, there are a couple stereotypes going on here. Puss in Boots from the Shrek movies and Sofia Vergara, especially in Modern Family, kind of like they have a sexy accent, right? Like that's how it's portrayed. It's seen as very attractive, and it makes like there's a certain kind of appeal to it. And then you have Speedy Gonzalez, and you have Danny Trejo. That's kind of the other stereotype. One of the other stereotypes associated with Spanish accent is that someone is a bandito or a criminal of some kind, right? French accents are often used for humor. You see Pepe Le Pew, totally blanking on the guy from Pink Panther, Lumiere from Beauty and the Beast. They're kind of funny, and they're also kind of like suave and seductive, right? That's kind of what a French accent means. You hear someone has a French accent, you know that they're going to be funny or really kind of like suave. Russians are almost always villains. I mean, these guys are all villains. They're shifty. They're big shirtless brutes. And this goes back to Cold War stereotypes, but you can see recently the portrayal of Vladimir Putin on Saturday Night Live kind of like keeps this stereotype alive that if someone is a Russian character, they're dangerous and they're a villain and they're shifty. South Asian accents, there are a couple stereotypes going on. So either someone who's kind of like nerdy or in tech, there's like Indian or Pakistani accent. They might own like a grocery store or 7-Eleven or gas station of some kind. Or then there's like the this is the shaman from Indiana Jones. There's kind of like a mystical, traditional vibe to it, which is based on like colonial ideas about cultures in that part of the world. East Asian is usually either used for humorous effect, that someone has an East Asian accent, like Japanese or Chinese or Korean, or with Mr. Miyagi and Karate Kid, it also means that they're like mystical and in tune with like traditional cultures. Germans, same thing as Russians, they're villains, whether they're literal Nazis or Bond villains of some kind. They're usually like very well dressed, often in a uniform, often like doctors or scientists of some kind, but generally across the board, evil. If someone has a German accent, they're usually the bad guy. So these are questions to kind of ask yourself about these stereotypes. So do all the accents have a specific stereotype associated with them? We saw that some have more than one maybe. Is there sometimes, some has more than one. How might the stereotypes we see associated with these accents shape our views and perceptions of real-life people of these accents, especially people we've never met before, right? The number of Russians I've seen on TV is infinite, but the number of native Russian speakers that I've met in real life is very, very small. Do you think accent stereotypes in children's movies have a bigger impact on the way people view speakers with those accents than stereotypes in movies geared towards adults? Why or why not, right? When you're a kid, certain things make more of an impression on you than when you're an adult, and you can separate what's in the movies and from what's real a little bit more. So those are some things to think about when you think about when you see someone with a foreign accent on TV or in a movie.
Yeah, so we started our talk saying that these are all myths and we're going to give you facts. So let's start seeing what studies have shown about why we have some attitudes toward non-native speakers. So first, this study was conducted, and I think that this study is brilliant. They looked at previous statements pronounced by native and non-native speakers. So people were saying exactly the same thing as ants don't sleep. And then they would ask people to rate the very same previous statement as true or not true. So they found out that every time it's a non-native speaker to say the previous statement, people would rate it as less truthful. And this is, so the effect is a clear reduction of credibility. So instead of perceiving the statements as more difficult to understand, they would just perceive them as less truthful. So they wouldn't even make the extra effort to try to bridge the gap in the different pronunciation or in different sounds, and they would just skip to the point where they would say, this is less true, so I'm not going to believe it. And as you can imagine, this can have serious consequences in a lot of different settings, the workplace, at university, in a classroom. So that's why it's important to understand that what really happens is that there's a processing difficulty in our brain because we recognize that those are different sounds. But instead of making that extra effort, we definitely jump to the point where we say, oh, it's going to be less true. But that's not correct. They're saying exactly the same statements. It's just a different way of saying them, of rephrasing them.
Yeah, so there's another study that looked at employee-client relations in the service industry. So they found out like when customers came in with a negative attitude heading into an interaction with someone from the service industry, right, you walk into the store, you're not in a good mood, found out their negative feelings increased when the person behind the counter had a foreign accent. And this has like a lot of implications for people on the other end, like employees, whether or not they're going to get tips, good reviews, things like that. And this is also supported by some of the findings that a different study found in a paper about call centers in India. So call center jobs are pretty common in South Asia, right? Some of you have probably called tech support and been on the phone with somebody in South Asia before. That's a lot of call centers get outsourced to that part of the world. A lot of people who work at these call centers undergo training to reduce their accents to sound more like the people who they're going to be calling. So that's often they try to sound American. So the author of the study found that she kind of studied one of these training centers where they try to get people's accents up just enough for their call center. But she found that these speakers kind of got caught in between two worlds. In India, a lot of the older speakers tend to have kind of British-sounding Indian accents because they went to private schools that were set up by the British during the colonial era. But some of these young people will try to sound American because they're trying to work at a call center where they're calling Americans. So older speakers will look down on them because they'll say, oh, they're not speaking like proper English, they're trying to sound American. And some of their peers will see them as like excessively upwardly mobile, like, oh, they think they're American now. But when they call people in the US, and this is where the negative assessments of people in the service industry comes in, is people still complain that they sound too foreign. So they sound too foreign for Americans, but too American for people in India. So it's a really unfortunate situation where people kind of get caught in between accents. They can't fully master an American accent, but by trying to do so, they alienate themselves from some of their peers. And this is a short clip from the movie Slumdog Millionaire. The main character takes over someone's ship at a call center.
Jamal, come in. I'm on millionaire duty today. Dave, please, just for 5 minutes. I can't. Sit here. If the team leader comes, just pretend you were on a call doing an upgrade for friends and family. I know. Yeah? 2 minutes.
Hello? Somebody can't stand again, for God's sake. Hello? Good God, will somebody talk to me?
Hello. Mrs. McIntosh from Kingusi.
It's Kinusella, pronounced Kinusi. So where are you from? Abroad, I bet?
Just down the road from your house, Mrs. McIntosh. Next to the lock.
Okay. Which lock?
Lock Big Ben. Next door to Sean Connery's flat.
Look, I'd like to speak to your supervisor, son.
Okay, so what's funny and sad about that clip is that this character is getting a impossible task crossed on him, right? Like in an instant, he's expected to like pass for a native speaker of English from Scotland specifically, which is a place he clearly doesn't know anything about. And even though he's competent in a lot of other ways, like he's being expected to be competent in language in this way that's like literally impossible because of the sound house and also because he hasn't had any experience with Scottish accents or Scotland or Scottish culture. So again, this idea that like competence, like the way you speak or the way, the sounds you use as a non-native speaker are not a reflection of your competence as an individual. Clearly this character is very smart. He's just not able to sound like he's from Scotland, which is pretty normal.
And I think that this is the example that is most familiar to everyone, which is what happens in an educational setting, let's say university. So you all probably know RateMyProfessor.com, which is this very popular website among students where anonymously students can leave a comment on a professor they had. So usually they have criteria, but they can also leave comments saying something about that professor. And in this study, they looked specifically at one of the functions they had that was clarity and helpfulness ratings, and they also paired that with comments referred to professors coming from East Asia, so mainly Korean professors, so non-native speakers. And what they found out is that systematically all those professors received lower ratings on clarity and helpfulness because of their accent. And that would have been phrased in ways like, that professor does have an accent, but, or they are hard to understand, don't take that professor unless you speak his or her language. And usually these are extremely exaggerated comments, and they don't focus on the competence on delivering a concept or teaching a subject, but they're only based on those language aptitudes and ideologies we talked about before. So what is happening? They're basically saying that students are more powerful than their professors just because they are native speakers and their professors are not native speakers. So they're just grouping all these professors as the incomprehensible other, and they're questioning if they're competent enough to teach that specific subject in a university setting. At the same time, they did find out that some of them try to resist this ideology of non-native speaker is less competent than a native speaker because they would add that but. So instead of saying that professor has an accent, period, they would add, but I could understand it after I got used to it. So they see that it's not just a matter of the accent, it's about what we have and the way we were socialized through this ideology. So a lot of them said that after a while they got used to that specific non-native accent, so they could tell what was happening. So sometimes it's a matter of practice. If you have a foreign friend at the beginning, it may take you some time to get used to their accent, but after a while, it's not that difficult. And I can tell it myself, even as a non-native speaker of English. I got better since I got here at understanding people speaking in English as their non-native speakers. So I am now better at understanding people coming from different places and speaking in English. So sometimes it's just a matter of practice. And we definitely don't want to link this attitudes and these ideologies with the actual competence of a professor teaching a subject.
And so there's actually some hard evidence of people making cognitive adjustments to non-native accents. There's a couple studies that have shown that speakers adjust to a foreign accent through repeated exposure. So what she was talking about anecdotally seems to be true. It's especially true for kids because they're still in that learning process, but adults tend, the more they hear an unfamiliar accent, the more their brains just generally tend to adjust to it. And it's been shown that exposure to accent and speech of all varieties makes people more likely to understand new foreign accents. So the more foreign accents you hear, the easier it is to hear a new foreign accent and be primed to try and decode what they're saying from the get-go. And this is consistent with studies that show that speakers adapt to understand dialects of the same language. So I find a lot of people in Scotland very difficult to understand, but studies show that if I moved there and lived there for a couple of years, I would generally start to adapt to be able to understand people better. Or if, like I mentioned, a British person moved to rural North Carolina, they might have some issues at first, but studies show that eventually they would start to understand speakers more and more. Your brain does amazing things in terms of adjusting to accents you've never heard before.
So I guess that we touch upon basically all the main points that we want you to have to try to disentangle all this difficult subject of speaking English as a non-native speakers. So everyone has an accent, both in their monolingual setting and also in multilingual setting. And that's something that we just have to learn and to be open to it and just embrace it as a thing and not use it as a thing against other people. And as we said, most speakers of English today are non-native. Think about the world and the globalization effects everywhere people speak English as non-native speakers. And definitely non-native accents are difficult to change. I've been learning English my whole life, and still, Italian only has 7 vowel sounds. So you can imagine that once I start speaking English and all those different sounds makes it very difficult to me. And as my original sound house only has 7 vowels, I cannot go back to the warehouse and buy the other 7 because that's what I was born with, what I got as my original sound house.
Yeah, and then again, speakers naturally adjust to new accents through repeated exposure. Again, this idea that if you're having problems with someone with a foreign accent, it's likely a lot of your negative feelings that you're feeling are likely because of ideology, because scientifically there's not really a reason for that. That person isn't necessarily less competent, even if it seems like they are. It's because that's the way they've been socialized to think about people with foreign accents. So yeah, someone who has a non-native accent, no matter how long they've lived somewhere, like the fact that someone has one, no matter how long they've lived somewhere, doesn't tell you anything about how hard they've worked to learn that language, doesn't tell you how long they've been speaking it, doesn't tell you how long they've lived in the new country. It just tells you that they have a different native language. That's it, that they have a different sound house to start with. So it's not fair to make any assumptions about that person's competence, intelligence, values, etc. And that goes for regional accents and dialects within a language too. It just means that that person has an accent. It doesn't tell you really anything else about that person on a deeper level, except for where they're from.
And just one last example, think at shoe sizes or weight. We all have different ones, and no one would ever tell you something about your shoe sizes because that's totally fine. And that's how we have to think about non-native accents. That's really the real point we want to make today, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, accents everybody has one. Some people have different ones based on where they're from, based on what their original language was. And that's that's fine, because people can't change that, and it's generally not good to give people a hard time for things they have absolutely no power over. So, yeah, I think that's it.
And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask.
This might be more related to like a dialect part. I was interested in like your stock characters, and so I was wondering if you looked at any examples of those stereotyped characters within literature. I'm thinking like I'm reading with my students Of Mice and Men, and it's examples like local color and dialect. So I didn't know if you looked at any instances where you had an author that was like manipulating text to show some kind of accent.
I mean, there's been a fair amount written about that. I'm not like a huge expert in that, but like there's been like people have talked about like we call it eye dialect, right? When you spell things out so that it looks like someone is speaking, so you can tell that somebody has an accent. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of stereotyping in literature. I know people have talked about like the way Mark Twain wrote like Jim's accent, right? And Huckleberry Finn would be considered maybe kind of offensive today in terms of the way it portrays an accent that Mark Twain himself didn't speak. He just heard other people speaking. So it's definitely the case in literature too.
Okay.
And this might be a little bit late for you, because I think you're a senior, but there's a class called American Dialects that you can take where it specifically looks at dialects in literature and music on that.
And I'm teaching it in the spring. And we talk all about that, why authors choose or don't choose to represent that in certain ways, when they do it, how they do it well, how they do it not so well, and what sort of messages are they trying to portray with those choices. So that's a great question.
Yeah, and the same thing happens with different languages in literature. So as we have people who could switch in everyday life, the same thing also happens in some literary works. So authors will bring in different languages in the same literary work.
I was thinking about when you were talking about the where are you from question and how that can reproduce ideologies about othering people with foreign accents. But, I mean, humans, every society has inverts and outverts. Can it also just be like curiosity?
That's a point. It's very hard to tell if that specific question, especially when it's someone you don't know, you don't really know, if that question is meant as curiosity.
It's like, where are you from? Or like,
Where are you
like
from? Yeah.
something about you is not the same as me.
Yeah.
Tell me about it.
Yes, and also a lot of times I have received that question, and it's not only just where are you from. They would add something else to let me understand that that is not meant to be an othering act, but they really want to know where I'm from. Yeah.
I think it's one of those things that people refer to as a microaggression, right? Where the intention is maybe not necessarily malicious in any way, but it ends up producing an ideology that would make the person feel othered or uncomfortable.
I mean, if you get asked 20 times in a new semester where you're from like 100 different people, like, I mean, like per day, then that gets grating after a while. So I also don't know what to say when someone says like where I'm from, so I'm still struggling with that.
Any other questions? Yes.
Would you say, based on what you've read, that one thing that impacts people's judgment is not only like ideologies that exist in societies, is it whether they go in with a negative attitude about the person, like, this person doesn't sound like me, I don't want to understand you, and I'm not going to? Like, is it your attitude towards the person?
I feel that would play, at least in my opinion, a big part to it. And that can also happen in a monolingual setting. Like the same attitudes you would have toward a person, even before that person speaks, might be the same as those toward a non-native speaker. And I think that as soon as we convince ourselves that we don't want to understand, that's not going to happen because we're not inclined to understand the other person, and we don't want to make the effort in the first place. So I think that it would play a big part to it.
Did anything in what you've read touch on like what is effective to combat stuff like accent hallucination or like lowered comprehension based on like a perceived accent? I know this seems kind of like a depressing
Yeah.
fact of life.
Yeah, I mean, exposure, I mean, how do you overcome any like negative ideologies that you were socialized in, like try to be exposed to more people who sound different and like be conscious of like the way you're judging someone before you know them.
And yeah, and also in the study I read on the previous statements, they found out that if they told the people before where the people who were saying the trigger statements were from, they could understand better. So if you know that you're going to listen to an Italian speaker in English, then you try to understand that that's what's very likely to happen before they talk. So you're kind of prepared to that foreign accent. That's the only thing that they added. Do you have anything?
Yes, I was wondering, like, so you talked about teachers being negatively impacted by that. Did you look at ways how to address that maybe in the beginning of the first class, or like, hey, I have a foreign accent, like, is there any strategies about that they mentioned?
I feel that having the first slide that we had in our presentation in every class would really help, because this is the approach that we should have to accents in every setting. So if students get into a classroom knowing that they are in a very inclusive environment, also on language, that would really help. And it would also help the professor being, if he or she is a non-native speaker, being at ease with their students, knowing that they're going to make that effort that she or he needs. Yeah.
So yeah, and I could just add that a lot of you said you've taken foreign language classes. That's maybe also a way to combat some of these stereotypes. Like if you know for yourself how hard it is to try and sound like a native speaker in another language, it could make you more sympathetic towards native speakers of English. I think that's it.
Yeah. Thanks for coming.